Hey there, horror lovers. I'm trying to hit 1,000 before the year ends, and you can help. If you love creepy stories, hit subscribe. It means the world to me. Now let's dive into some terrifying new Reddit stories. Some of the scariest yet. Turn off the lights, put on your headphones, and let the horror begin. We're starting with,
Tell your stories about Michael Myers.
I thought I had learned my lesson. I thought I was safe. I was wrong. The first 2 encounters should have been enough. But I became obsessed with trying to figure out who he was and why. This final story happened last Halloween. I tried to avoid the town, to stay away from anything that could remind me of Michael Myers. But he wasn't done with me yet. The night started out normal enough. I had locked all the doors and windows and tried to forget the fact that the date on the calendar was October 31st. I turned off all the lights and sat with my phone in the dark, waiting for the night to end. And then the power went out. The house was plunged into complete darkness, and I felt a familiar dread creeping into my soul. I fumbled around for my flashlight, and when I turned it on, I noticed something strange. There was a shadow on the wall, a tall, looming shadow that stretched all the way up to the ceiling. I turned slowly, and there he was, standing right behind me, just a few feet away. He was holding a large silver knife, the blade gleaming in the dim light. I hadn't even heard him. It was like he had just materialized from the darkness. My fear was intense. I felt like my organs were all going to stop working. I stumbled backward, knocking over a small table, the sound shattering the silence. He was silent as ever, his mask staring through me as he slowly moved closer. I tried to scream, but my voice was gone. I was trapped. I was cornered. I ran blindly, desperately searching for a way out as he slowly, methodically followed me. I could feel his presence, that cold, dark presence that seemed to suck the life out of everything around him. I stumbled into the kitchen, grabbing a heavy cast iron skillet from the stove. I turned, ready to fight, when I realized I was trapped. He had blocked the door. I swung the skillet, hitting him square on the side of his head. The impact was brutal, and I thought for a second. I had finally managed to hurt him, to stop him. But the only thing it did was anger him. He grabbed the skillet from me and threw it to the floor. He was now in front of me, the knife in his hand poised to strike. Then he stopped. He tilted his head, just as he had done so many times before. It was as if he was studying me, trying to decide what to do. Then he turned and disappeared into the darkness. I never saw him again that night, but I know that he's still out there. I know that he will always be out there, waiting, watching. And now, you know it too.
I've always been drawn to the forgotten places, the husks of buildings left to decay in the undergrowth. It was a morbid curiosity, I suppose, a fascination with the echoes of the past. That's how I found myself on the edge of the old Warren County Asylum, just outside of Haddonfield. I'd heard stories about it, of course. Whispers of inhumane experiments, of desperate screams, and of a patient who was never truly contained. The locals avoided the place like a festering wound, and for good reason. It was a late afternoon in early October, the sky bruised with the colors of an oncoming storm. The air was thick and cold, and an eerie silence clung to the place, broken only by the rustling of dead leaves beneath my boots. The perimeter fence was rusted and broken in places, easy enough to slip through, which is what I did. The asylum's main building loomed before me, a Gothic monstrosity of crumbling brick and shattered windows. It was like a decaying tooth in the landscape, a reminder of what we try to bury in our minds. As I made my way around the back, the sound of crows took flight in a squawking, panicked chorus. They circled above the tree line, and their fear made my own gut clench. It was then that I noticed something. A silhouette at one of the upper story windows. It was tall and motionless, its presence an inexplicable weight in the fading light. It was too far to make out any details, but the sheer stillness of the figure was bone-chilling. The shape of it felt like it was observing me. Not watching, but studying, dissecting me. I stood frozen, the breath catching in my throat. The air felt colder, heavier, as if the surrounding space was now occupied with a dark, unspoken threat. Then, very slowly, the figure began to turn, its head rotating as if it were a puppet on a string. For one fleeting second, I thought I caught a glimpse of something pale, a stark white against the blackness behind the broken window pane. A mask. The next moment, it vanished, melting back into the darkness of the building. I didn't wait. I didn't think. I ran, my heart pounding in my chest, my lungs burning with each gasp of air. I didn't look back. The image was burned into my retinas. I saw that silhouette every time I closed my eyes. That night, the asylum became much more than just an abandoned building. It became the place where I first felt the cold, deliberate stare of Michael Myers.
I grew up near Haddonfield. The name alone brings back memories of fear and rumors. I had made it my life's work to debunk those fears. I was a cynic, a skeptic, and I thought I'd heard all the ghost stories. That is, until I was out one night exploring old back roads. I was documenting local history, trying to capture the feeling of these old places. It was late, way too late to be out alone, on a night in late September. I was on a stretch of road that was barely more than a path, the trees forming a dense, suffocating canopy above. The headlights of my car barely cut through the darkness. The radio was full of static, and I remember the hairs on the back of my neck had begun to stand up. I was about a mile from the nearest house. The road was silent. I stopped the car, got out to photograph what looked like a long-abandoned farmhouse. It was a shell, the roof caved in, the walls crumbling, the porch falling apart. As I was taking pictures, I noticed something. I heard a noise, or more of a feeling that the silence was being broken. I turned. Then I saw him, not more than 20 feet away, in the shadows between the trees. He was standing still as a statue, and for a second I could not comprehend what I was looking at. The dark coveralls and the pale, featureless mask. That cold, emotionless mask that turned and stared right at me. It was an image pulled right from my worst nightmares. A chill ran down my spine, and I felt the air leave my lungs. My mind struggled to reconcile the stories with the horrific reality standing before me. He took a step forward, and another, the crunch of leaves under his heavy boots sounding like a death knell in the silent woods. I remember grabbing my camera. I snapped a picture and my flash went off. I could see his mask even more clearly now. It was the face of pure, unadulterated evil. It was as if the mask wasn't a mask, but the true expression of the darkness dwelling within him. It gave me a brief feeling of dread. He stood there for a moment, studying me, his head tilted to the side, and I noticed a glint of metal half hidden by his sleeve. My blood turned to ice. I dropped my camera, scrambled back into my car, and slammed the door. I turned the key and the engine roared to life, and I didn't dare wait a moment longer. I slammed the car into reverse and I sped away, glancing in my rearview mirror as I did. He stood there motionless, watching me disappear into the darkness. I drove home as fast as I could, and when I got back, I looked at the picture I had taken. The figure stood at the edge of the forest, as clear as day. I knew then I'd come far closer to the truth about Michael Myers than I ever wanted to. That wasn't just a story anymore.
I had tried to convince myself every single day that what I had seen, both times, was not real. That my mind had been playing tricks on me, that there was an explanation. But the closer it got to Halloween, the less sure I felt. I started sleeping with a baseball bat next to my bed, and I started paying a lot more attention to the shadows. This Halloween night was like no other I had experienced. I felt it in my bones, a sense of impending dread that made my stomach churn. It was the culmination of everything. I knew he was coming. I barricaded myself inside my home, locking every door and window, drawing all the curtains. The house was dark and silent, save for the rhythmic ticking of the clock. I was armed with a knife. I had called the police, but there was no answer. Just as the final trick-or-treaters gave way to the night, the house began to feel different, colder, more oppressive, as if something had come inside with the darkness. The floorboards started to creak, and the walls began to feel like they were closing in on me. It was like he was toying with me, slowly turning the screws. I felt a prickle of fear course through me. Then it came, the soft thud at the back door, like someone tapping to see if anyone was home. I gripped my knife so tight my knuckles went white. I crept to the door, peering through the peephole. He was there, the shape, in all his terrifying glory, his mask as cold and expressionless as the night itself. He tilted his head, his eyes, or whatever was behind that dark void, fixed on the peephole. He knew I was watching. The tapping turned into a gentle push, and the door groaned under the pressure. I jumped back, my heart pounding against my ribs, the sound echoing in my ears. He wasn't breaking down the door, he was methodically, slowly, opening it. A cold gust of air swept into the house as he stepped inside. He moved silently, like a predator, his heavy boots making no sound against the carpet. I could hear the slow, deliberate rhythm of his breathing. He was hunting me now, and I was cornered, alone with the embodiment of pure evil. I grabbed a nearby heavy vase, clutching it tight. I waited, my breath held, my muscles tense. He rounded the corner, knife raised, ready to strike. I screamed, lunged, and slammed the vase against the side of his head. I felt a split second of hope, and then he was turning, and now his gaze was upon me, the mask, the black eyes, and then he was coming. The knife in his hand was a blur. I don't know what happened after that. The world faded to black. I have no idea how I am alive to tell this story, but I do, and I have to, because I know he's still out there. He's always out there, waiting, watching.
My family owns a small cabin up on Lake Willow, a place we've been visiting for generations. It's secluded, surrounded by thick woods, and for most of the year, it's wonderfully peaceful. That feeling of peace, however, started to feel very far away. This story happened at the end of September, the leaves just beginning to turn their autumn colors. I had gone up to the cabin alone for a weekend, seeking some quiet and solitude, trying to escape the city and its pressures. The days were lovely, crisp and clear, but the nights were different. The first night was fine, but I started getting this weird feeling on the second night, like I was being watched. I'd be sitting by the fire and I'd feel the hair on the back of my neck rise. A cold breeze running across my skin even though the windows were all shut tight. I would look out to the tree line and see nothing, but I'd still feel it, like a stare. I chalked it up to the cabin being an old place and the solitude making me a little paranoid. I turned in early, trying to sleep it off, and that's when it happened. I was just drifting off when I heard it. A soft thud from downstairs. It was faint, but it was enough to jolt me awake. My heart began to hammer. I sat up, trying to tell myself it was just the wind, or maybe an animal outside. But then I heard it again, followed by a soft scraping sound, like something was being dragged across the wooden floor. It wasn't an animal. It was much too methodical. I quietly reached for my phone and dialed the police, and as I put the phone to my ear, I heard the heavy sound of boots. They were slow, and they were coming closer. My breath caught in my throat, and I held my breath as the footsteps ascended the stairs. I knew I was cornered. I grabbed a small fire poker next to the bed, and then he was at the door. I saw the doorknob turn slowly, and I held the fire poker in front of me, my knuckles white and shaking. Then the door creaked open, and I saw him, silhouetted in the dim light of the hallway. He wore his familiar dark coveralls, and I could see the stark white of that mask, expressionless and cold. He didn't say a word. He didn't make a move. He just stood there, staring at me, his head tilted to the side as if he was trying to figure me out. That's when I saw it, the glint of a knife, his hand resting on the handle. I didn't wait to see what he would do next. I threw the fire poker at him, dove under the bed, and pushed a heavy dresser in front of the door. I could hear him moving about in the room, but he couldn't get to me. The police arrived, and when they searched the house, no one was there. It's been almost a year since that night, and I still see his face in the darkness. I still feel the weight of his stare.
I used to think that Halloween was a fun holiday, a chance to dress up and to have a good time. It's a night where monsters aren't real. But last year, everything changed. I went to a costume party at my friend's house. It was a big bash, everyone dressed up, lots of laughter and loud music. I remember it so vividly because it was the last moment I ever felt completely safe. I remember at some point in the evening the lights went out, some people screaming and laughing, everyone thinking it was part of the party. But when the lights came back on, it wasn't the same. The mood had changed. There was a palpable sense of dread that settled over the house. I walked to the kitchen and I noticed a figure standing in the corner, perfectly still. Everyone thought it was part of a joke. It was too perfect of a costume. The dark coveralls, the emotionless mask. But I could see in the dim light that there was something wrong. There was a stillness, an unnatural quality to this person that sent a shiver down my spine. I saw others try to talk to him, try to get him to move, but the figure remained completely motionless. Then something happened. One of my friends playfully put his arm on the figure's shoulder and the figure turned, slowly, methodically. The silence in the room was deafening. The masked figure reached out and grabbed my friend by his wrist. My friend tried to pull away, but the grip was too strong, like a vice. The figure didn't say anything. It didn't need to. The sheer force of his presence filled the room with an overwhelming sense of dread. We all watched in horror, unable to move, as the figure took out a long, sharp knife. The room was a blur of screams and chaos. I saw a person get slashed across the arm. People were running for their lives. I managed to hide in a closet, my heart hammering in my chest. I heard his heavy boots, his methodical movements coming closer. I closed my eyes, bracing for the inevitable. Then I heard a crash and the sound of people running away from the house. I peeked out of the closet, and he was gone. I don't know what happened to him after that. I don't think anyone does. But I know that he's out there, and I know that Halloween will never be the same again.
I work as a security guard at the Haddonfield Historical Society, and I spend a lot of time exploring old maps and records. I've always been fascinated by the history of the town, and I've spent countless hours researching its secrets. That is how I came to learn about the old Haddonfield General Hospital, the original building, long abandoned and left to decay. It was located deep in the woods, several miles outside of the city. It had been closed decades ago after some kind of scandal, and the building was never torn down, never reused. Curiosity got the best of me, so I decided to check it out. It was a bitterly cold night in late December, the air sharp and crisp, the ground covered in a thin layer of ice. I parked my car and started hiking through the woods, the darkness closing in around me. The old hospital was a hulking, Gothic structure, surrounded by a high, rusting fence. The windows were shattered, and the walls were covered in graffiti. The whole place felt like a decaying corpse, a reminder of a past that no one wanted to remember. The main entrance was boarded up, so I went around to the back. There was a door hanging off its hinges, and I stepped inside. The interior of the hospital was worse than I had imagined. The rooms were filled with old, rusted medical equipment, broken furniture, and decaying paperwork. The smell was overwhelming, a mix of disinfectant, mold, and something else, something sickly sweet and very disturbing. As I moved deeper into the building, I heard it, a low, guttural growl coming from somewhere below. It wasn't an animal, it was something darker. I followed the sound, going down a flight of stairs to the basement. The basement was pitch black. I turned on my flashlight and swept the beam across the room. And then I saw him, standing in the corner of the room, completely still. He was surrounded by discarded medical supplies, needles and bandages. He seemed to be sorting through it. His head was tilted slightly, as if he was studying the objects in his hands. I recognized the dark coveralls and the pale, expressionless mask. It was him, Michael Myers. My heart leapt in my chest, my breath catching in my throat. I didn't move, paralyzed by fear. He finally stopped what he was doing and turned his attention to me. It was like stepping into the void, all light seeming to vanish as I stared into his eyes, or the place where his eyes should be. He took a step towards me, and I knew that I had to get out of there. I turned and ran, my feet pounding on the concrete floor, the image of his mask seared into my mind. I didn't stop until I was back outside, gasping for breath in the cold night air. I ran all the way back to my car and drove home as fast as I could, the sound of his low growl echoing in my ears. That night, the hospital became something far worse than a relic of the past. It became a living testament to the horror of Michael Myers.